Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I am here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. There's a reason I don't live alone anymore. Some people enjoy the solitude, peaceful nights, the freedom to do whatever they want, whenever they want. I used to be one of those people. I thought moving into my own apartment was the first step into real adulthood. No roommates, no sharing a fridge, no waiting for the bathroom. Just me, my own space, and silence when I needed it. The apartment was nothing special. A small one-bedroom unit on the third floor of an old building. The kind of place that had character, as the landlord put it. That was a nice way of saying the floors creaked, the pipes rattled, and sometimes, if the wind hit just right, the windows would shudder like they were ready to give out. But I didn't mind. It was cheap, close to work, and most importantly, mine. I moved in during the fall, right when the days were getting shorter. My work schedule had me out most of the day, so I usually got home when it was already dark. The first couple of weeks were normal. I'd come home, heat up something frozen for dinner, watch TV until I got tired, then go to bed. Sometimes I'd hear my neighbors, the woman downstairs arguing on the phone, the guy next door moving furniture at odd hours, but that was city living. You learn to tune it out. My apartment was simple but comfortable. A couch that had seen better days, a tiny kitchen with just enough counter space to cook if I ever bothered, and a bedroom barely big enough for my bed and a dresser. The walls were thin, but I didn't have much to complain about. It was just me, after all. The building itself had a certain charm. Brick walls, a narrow staircase, and an elevator that made you hold your breath every time it moved. The hallway lights flickered sometimes, but that just added to the atmosphere. The landlord, an older man who barely showed up, told me the building was old but solid. Been here longer than most of us, he had said with a chuckle when I signed the lease. I didn't think much of it at the time. For the first few weeks, everything felt normal. My days were routine. Wake up, shower, head to work, come home, watch something, sleep. Nothing unusual, nothing to write home about. Just a quiet, uneventful life in my own space. But then, things changed. At first, it was small things. A door I swore I closed would be slightly open. A light that I didn't remember turning on would be glowing when I walked in. I blamed myself. I was probably just tired, not paying attention. It's easy to forget the little things when you're running on autopilot. But then, I started waking up in the middle of the night. Not because of a bad dream or a sudden noise. I'd just wake up, eyes open in the dark, heart pounding for no reason. The room would feel off, like something had just moved, just shifted, just left the space before I could catch it. I told myself it was just the adjustment period. Living alone for the first time could do weird things to your brain. Maybe I was just not used to the silence. Except it wasn't silent. It was always around 2 or 3 in the morning when I'd wake up. And when I did, I'd hear it. Footsteps. Not the muffled thumps of a neighbor upstairs. Not the distant shuffle of someone in the hallway. These were inside my apartment. Soft, slow, pacing. I'd lie there, frozen, listening. I tried to convince myself it was the building settling, that maybe the old wooden floors just creaked from time to time. But the sound was too deliberate, a pattern, a weight shifting from one foot to the other. One night, I finally worked up the courage to get up and check. I held my breath as I pushed the blankets off, every muscle in my body tense. The room was dark, but nothing seemed out of place. I stepped into the hallway, heart hammering. The light from the street lamps outside cast long, stretched out shadows through the blinds. I flipped on the switch, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. The apartment was empty. The door was locked. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always the same time, always the same sound. A slow, steady pace, right outside my bedroom door. And every time I got up to check, I found nothing. That was when I started to notice other things. The air in my apartment felt heavier at night, like the walls were pressing in. The shadows seemed darker, stretching into corners they had no business reaching. My reflection in the bathroom mirror felt wrong. I can't explain it. Just wrong. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. That was the first time I felt actual fear. Lying there, staring at the door in the dim light, I felt something I hadn't before. I wasn't alone. I didn't move. I barely breathed. And then, as if whatever was there had changed its mind, the door slowly swung shut again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had convinced myself it was just a draft. Old buildings do that. Doors don't always stay closed. Floors creak. Shadows play tricks. That's what I told myself. I almost believed it. But deep down, I knew something was in that apartment with me, and it wasn't going anywhere. The first time I truly couldn't explain what was happening, I had just come home from work. It was a late shift, the kind that drags on longer than it should, and by the time I stepped into my apartment, all I wanted to do was eat something quick and pass out. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter like I always did, kicked off my shoes, and shrugged off my jacket, letting it fall onto the chair near the door. The apartment was quiet, exactly how I left it that morning. I remember standing in the kitchen, waiting for my food to heat up in the microwave. My phone buzzed on the counter, just a work email. I sighed, rubbed my eyes, and leaned against the fridge. Then I heard it. A click. A soft, unmistakable click. I turned my head toward the sound, and my stomach dropped. The bathroom door, which I always left open, was shut. I stood there for a long moment, the hum of the microwave suddenly the loudest sound in the world. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe I had closed it without thinking. Maybe it had swung shut on its own. But the door wasn't just closed, it was latched. I knew that because the handle had just moved. I swallowed hard, my pulse pounding in my ears. I forced a breath through my nose, trying to stay calm. "All right," I muttered under my breath, barely recognizing my own voice. I took a step forward, then another. The apartment felt different, heavier. I reached out and gripped the bathroom door handle. Turned it. It was locked. I blinked. That didn't make sense. There was no one in there. I knocked once. Silence. A long, empty silence. Then, click. The lock unlatched. The door creaked open an inch. I stepped back so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. My hands were shaking. My breath was caught somewhere between my chest and throat. The microwave beeped behind me, making me jump. I had no choice. I had to open the door. With my heart slamming against my ribs, I reached forward and pushed. The bathroom was empty. Nothing was out of place. No open window, no draft. Just my own reflection staring back at me in the mirror. I stood there for a moment, gripping the edge of the sink, trying to slow my breathing. I told myself I was overreacting. Doors stick. Locks jam. Maybe I had latched it earlier without remembering. I turned off the light and left the door wide open this time. For the rest of the night, I tried to push it out of my mind. But when I finally crawled into bed, something gnawed at me. That sound. That click. It was deliberate. It had waited for me. The next day, I came home earlier than usual. A part of me didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel uneasy in my own space. Everything looked normal. My keys were still on the counter, my jacket still draped over the chair. But something felt off. I couldn't explain it, but the air in the apartment seemed Wrong. Like I had just missed something. Like I had walked into a room someone had just stepped out of. I shook it off, made some food, and tried to go about my night as usual. I was in the middle of brushing my teeth when it happened again. The bathroom door moved. This time, I saw it. Not a breeze. Not a random shift. It pulled shut. Slow. Precise. I spun around, toothpaste foaming in my mouth, my hand gripping the sink so hard my knuckles turned white. The door shut completely, just like the night before. And then, click. The lock engaged. I stood frozen, toothbrush still in my hand, the mirror fogging up with my breath. Every hair on my body stood on end. I stared at the door. My voice came out strained. Hello? No response. The apartment was silent. I took a step back, then another. My heart was racing, my mind trying to catch up. Then, just like before, click. The lock unlatched. The door creaked open an inch. I ran out of the bathroom. I didn't care if I was acting paranoid. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and left the apartment. I spent the next few hours at a 24-hour diner down the street, sipping on bad coffee, trying to convince myself I wasn't losing it. I thought about calling someone, maybe a friend, maybe even the landlord, but what was I supposed to say? Hey, I think my bathroom door has a mind of its own? No. No one would believe me. Hell, I didn't believe me. I stayed at the diner until I was too exhausted to keep my eyes open. Eventually, I convinced myself that it had to be a coincidence. A weird trick of the old apartment. By the time I got back, it was almost 3 a.m. The apartment was silent. The bathroom door was wide open. I checked the lock 3 times before going to bed. That night, I barely slept, and for the first time since moving in, I started wondering if I had made a mistake living alone. The next few days, I tried to ignore it. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just the building settling, just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. Because every night, between 2 and 3 a.m., I still heard the footsteps. Pacing. Slow. Heavy. Right outside my bedroom door. At first, I tried to ignore it. I told myself that if I just went about my life like normal, everything would settle down. It had to. But it didn't. In fact, things only got worse. The footsteps outside my bedroom door became a nightly occurrence. Always between 2 and 3 a.m. Always slow, deliberate, heavy. It started with just a few steps. A slow pass down the hallway, then silence. But after a few nights, the pattern changed. The steps would stop right outside my door. Just stand there. Waiting. I would lie in bed, my breath shallow, listening, feeling that presence just beyond the thin wooden barrier. It never knocked, never rattled the handle, but it didn't need to. I could feel it. Some nights, I stayed awake the entire time, gripping my blankets, barely blinking. Other nights, I forced myself to sleep through it, but I always woke up feeling drained, like I hadn't rested at all. Then, it started moving things. The first time I knew something was wrong, I came home late again. The apartment was exactly how I left it, except for one thing. My keys weren't on the counter. They were in the middle of the living room floor. I stopped in the doorway, my stomach twisting. My brain ran through every possible explanation. Maybe I had dropped them. Maybe they had fallen somehow. But no, they weren't just fallen. They were placed there, directly in the center of the room, like someone had set them down on purpose. I stared at them for a long time, the silence in the apartment pressing against my ears. My breath came out shaky as I bent down and picked them up. I tried not to let it bother me, but I felt it then. That same heavy sensation in the air, like I was being watched, like someone had just left the room. I swallowed hard, shook my head, and muttered under my breath, "Losing it, man." I turned on every light in the apartment after that. It kept happening. Small things at first. A glass I swore I left in the sink would be back on the counter. My bedroom door, always left open, would be shut in the morning. Then, one night, I woke up outside my bedroom. I don't know how long I had been standing there, but when I came to, I was in the hallway, facing the bathroom door. And the worst part? The door was open. Wide open. Like it had been waiting for me. My hands were cold. My feet felt like lead. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought I might pass out. I stumbled back into my room and locked the door. I barely slept. At this point, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was wrong with my apartment. And it wasn't just in my head. I started testing things. I would place objects in specific ways, take pictures, and check them later. Every time, something was different. The salt shaker moved 2 inches to the left. The closet door cracked open just slightly. It was subtle, almost mocking. I even set up my phone to record while I slept. The first few nights, I caught nothing, just me tossing and turning. Then on the 4th night, I woke up to my phone on the floor, face down. And when I checked the footage, my bedroom door opened by itself. So silent. At exactly 2:47 a.m. And then, for the next 6 minutes, nothing. Just an empty doorway. And then, footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Pacing just outside the frame. And then, the video cut out. My entire body went cold. I stared at the screen, my breathing ragged. I played it again and again, trying to see something, anything, but the hallway was just empty. Except for those footsteps. That was the night I stopped sleeping. I started staying out later, avoiding the apartment as much as possible. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was letting my mind play tricks on me. But then, something happened that I couldn't explain. Something that made me realize I wasn't just dealing with strange noises or misplaced objects. Something in that apartment knew me. It was watching me, and it wanted me to know. I had been sitting on my couch, scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. The bathroom mirror. From where I was sitting, I could just barely see inside the bathroom. The mirror faced the hallway, reflecting part of the apartment behind me. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't right. It took me a second to process what I was seeing. The bathroom door was open, just like in real life. But in the mirror, there was a shadow standing in the doorway. I froze. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My eyes stayed locked on that mirror, my entire body numb with cold fear. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I turned my head. The hallway behind me was empty. But when I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. I grabbed my jacket and keys and left the apartment without a second thought. I didn't stop walking until I was several blocks away, my hands still shaking. I didn't know where to go, who to call. All I knew was that I couldn't go back there. But I did, because I had no choice. Because I had to know. And when I stepped inside that apartment later that night, the first thing I saw was my phone, sitting face up on the kitchen counter, recording. My stomach twisted. I reached for it, my fingers numb, and pressed stop. The video was over 2 hours long. I hit play. The screen was dark at first, the apartment completely silent. Then, at 2:48 a.m., the bedroom door opened. But this time, it wasn't just footsteps. This time, something spoke. A whisper. Low, almost distant. One single word. My name. And then, the screen went black. If you're still here, let me know in the comments. What would you do if this happened to you? Because at this point, I knew one thing for certain. I was not alone in that apartment. And whatever was there, it knew my name. I didn't go back to the apartment the next night, or the night after that. I couldn't. After watching that recording, after hearing my own name spoken in that slow, deliberate whisper, I knew I wasn't dealing with my imagination. I wasn't sleepwalking. I wasn't misplacing things. Something was inside that apartment. Something that had been watching me, waiting. And now, it wanted me to know it was there. I spent 2 nights sleeping in my car. Not real sleep, though. Just hours of staring at the dark windshield, flinching at every sound, every shadow. But on the 3rd night, I had no choice. My phone was dying, my money was running low, and I had nowhere else to go. So I went back, and that was the worst mistake I could have made. It was just after midnight when I unlocked the door. I stood there for a long moment, staring into the dark apartment. Something felt wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, the way it feels right before a thunderstorm. The smell of dust and something stale clung to the air, stronger than before. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. My shoes echoed against the hardwood, louder than they should have. The entire place felt too still, like it had been waiting for me. I kept my back against the door for a moment, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No whispers. Just that awful, pressing silence. I turned on every light, checked every room. Everything looked the same, normal, but I knew better now. I wasn't alone. I sat on the couch, phone clutched in my hand, my leg bouncing with nervous energy. I didn't even know what I was waiting for. Maybe I wanted proof. Maybe I wanted to see it for myself. Or maybe I was just too afraid to sleep. Either way, I stayed awake. And at 2:47 a.m., the air changed. It was subtle at first. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped. And then, the footsteps started. Not slow this time. Not cautious. Heavy. Purposeful. Coming straight toward me. My entire body went cold. The hallway light dimmed, like something was moving in front of it. Then, the TV turned on. Static. Loud. Overpowering. I flinched, my breath catching in my throat. My hand shook as I reached for the remote. And then, through the static, a voice. Low. Garbled. Almost like it was trying to form words. I dropped the remote. My heart slammed against my ribs. I didn't move, didn't blink. Then, a shadow passed in front of the TV. Not a reflection. Not my own. Something tall. Something wrong. It flickered in and out of the static like a glitch in reality, its shape distorting. And then, it turned toward me. The static swelled, louder and louder, like it was screaming. I stumbled back, my body shaking. The light in the hallway went out. And then, footsteps. Rushing toward me. I ran. Straight for the door. But the moment I reached for the knob, it locked. I yanked at it, my breath ragged. Behind me, the static cut out. Silence. Thick. Suffocating. I turned my head, and it was there. Standing in the hallway, closer than before, watching me. I couldn't see its face, couldn't tell if it even had one. Just a shape, tall, wrong, shifting. It didn't move, but I felt it, pressing against my chest, inside my head. I squeezed my eyes shut. My hands trembled as I tried the door again, my fingers numb. Please, please, please. And then, a whisper, right against my ear. Stay. I wrenched the door open and ran. I don't remember how I got down the stairs. I don't remember how I got to my car. I just remember shaking, cold, breathless. When I finally looked up at the apartment window, the lights were off. The place looked empty, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew the truth, and I would never go back. If you've made it this far, tell me, what would you have done? Would you have stayed? Because something tells me that thing wasn't just in my apartment. It was waiting for me to come back. I don't know how long I sat in my car that night. The engine was off, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath came in short, uneven gasps. My entire body felt frozen, locked in place by something deeper than fear. I just kept staring at the apartment window. Nothing moved. No lights flickered back on. No shadows passed by. It was like the apartment had swallowed everything that had just happened, leaving only the quiet, empty shell of a place I had once called home. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I felt. And I knew I couldn't stay here. I don't remember starting the car. I don't remember pulling out of the parking lot. But at some point, I found myself on the freeway, headlights cutting through the dark, hands still trembling on the wheel. I drove. For miles. No destination in mind. Just away. Away from that apartment. Away from whatever was in there. It wasn't until the first hints of daylight broke across the horizon that I finally pulled into an empty gas station lot and let out the breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My phone was dead. My mind felt scrambled, like I couldn't piece together what was real and what wasn't. But I knew one thing. I couldn't go back. Later that morning, I borrowed a charger from the gas station clerk and turned my phone back on. A flood of missed calls and texts popped up. Most were from my landlord. The last voicemail he left was short, but his voice sounded different, tight, serious. "Look, I need to talk to you. You left your apartment unlocked. If you're not coming back, let me know." I hesitated. Then, against every bit of logic screaming at me to leave it alone, I called him back. He picked up on the first ring. "You coming back or not?" "No," I said immediately. I can't." There was a long pause. Then, in a quieter voice, he asked, "Did you see something?" My stomach dropped, the way he said it, like he already knew. I swallowed. "What do you mean?" Heavy sigh. "Then, that apartment, it's been empty a lot." My grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean, empty?" Another pause. "People don't stay there long." I felt cold all over again. He didn't say much else. Just that over the years, tenants had left without warning. Some breaking their lease. Some leaving all their belongings behind. And every time, when the apartment sat empty, strange things would happen. Lights turning on by themselves. Footsteps. Shadows where there shouldn't be any. Maintenance workers refused to go in alone. Even he avoided it. Yet, for some reason, he still rented it out. "People always think they're just imagining things," he said, "until they're not." I wanted to ask more. I wanted to know what he wasn't saying, but I already knew the truth. I had lived it, and I wasn't going back. That was over a year ago. I never returned to get my things. I told the landlord to throw everything away. I moved to a different city, a different state. But even now, even when I know I'm far away, there are nights when I wake up cold, like the air has shifted, like something is standing in the dark just outside my field of vision, watching, waiting. And sometimes I still hear it, that faint whisper in the dark, saying my name. I don't talk about it much. Not because I don't want to, but because most people wouldn't believe me. They'd tell me it was stress, lack of sleep, maybe even sleep paralysis. Some might say I imagined the whole thing, that my mind twisted small, explainable moments into something bigger, something terrifying. But they weren't there. They didn't hear the footsteps in the empty apartment. They didn't see the shadows that moved without a source. They didn't feel that presence watching them in the dark. I did. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how far away I am from that place, the memory is burned into me. For months after leaving, I found myself questioning everything. I avoided dim hallways. I double-checked every door I locked. I kept a light on at night, convincing myself that as long as I could see my surroundings, it'd be safe. But fear doesn't disappear just because you change locations. I still had nightmares, twisted, suffocating dreams where I was back in that apartment, trapped in the dark. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, convinced for a split second that I'd hear the floor creak outside my door again. But the worst part, it wasn't the nightmares. It was the moments in real life when I'd be sitting in my new apartment in broad daylight and feel that same uneasy stillness settle over me. Like I wasn't alone. Like something had followed me. I've never told my new landlord what happened before. I never asked if anyone left this place suddenly. And I never did any research on my old apartment either. I don't want to know. Maybe that makes me a coward. But I've come to accept that some things don't need an explanation. Some things aren't meant to be understood. Some doors are better left closed. If there's anything I've learned, it's this. We like to believe we control the spaces we live in. That walls, doors, and locks keep the outside world separate from the comfort of our homes. But not all spaces belong to us. Not everything stays in the past. And sometimes when something wants to be noticed, it makes sure you notice it. Even if it takes years. Even if it means following you. Even if it's watching right now. This story isn't one I tell often, mostly because I still don't fully understand what happened. It wasn't just a single night of terror or a quick brush with the unexplained. It was a slow, creeping invasion into my life, one that started with something as simple as a misplaced key. It changed the way I look at my own home, the way I trust my own mind. It all started last fall. I had just moved into a new house, nothing fancy, just a modest single-story home in a quiet neighborhood. The kind of place where people wave as they pass, but no one really knows each other. That was fine by me. I had always liked my space, and after a messy breakup, I was looking forward to the solitude. The house itself had been on the market for a while, which was great for my budget. I remember the first time I stepped inside. The air was heavy, as if the house had been waiting too long for someone to breathe life back into it. The hardwood floors creaked under my weight, but the place was in good shape. A little outdated, sure, but nothing that a few minor renovations couldn't fix. The kitchen had that old, slightly yellowed linoleum that curled at the edges, and the cabinets had those tiny metal handles that looked like they belonged in a 1970s diner. The living room had a fireplace, though I had yet to test if it worked. The best part, though, was the quiet. The walls were thick, and at night, it was just me and the occasional hum of the refrigerator. No upstairs neighbors stomping around, no city noise bleeding through the windows. Just silence. For the first few weeks, things were normal. I'd wake up early, make coffee, scroll through my phone before heading out to work. I kept to a routine: wake up, work, come home, eat, sleep. The house felt like mine, and I was settling in faster than I expected. But then, little things started happening. At first, they were easy to dismiss. A light left on that I swore I had turned off. A drawer slightly open when I was sure I had closed it. Nothing dramatic, just tiny inconsistencies that could have been absent-mindedness. I was tired. Moving into a new place was stressful, and work had been demanding, so I brushed it off. Then there was the key. I kept a spare house key on a small hook by the front door. It was the only extra one I had, and I rarely used it. But one morning, when I went to grab my car keys from the same hook, the house key was missing. I searched everywhere. My pockets, my bag, the counters. I retraced my steps from the night before. I even checked the lock, just in case I had left it in the door somehow. Nothing. It was annoying, but I figured I must have misplaced it. Maybe it had fallen behind the small table near the door. I made a mental note to look for it later and left for work. That night, when I got home, I found the key sitting in the middle of the kitchen counter. At first, I laughed it off. Maybe I had absent-mindedly dropped it there while carrying groceries. Maybe I had picked it up, forgotten, and put it down while making coffee. There were 100 reasonable explanations. Still, something about it nagged at me. It wasn't just that I had found it, it was the way it was placed. Dead center on the counter, perfectly aligned with the edge, like someone had deliberately set it there. I let it go. Things like that happen, right? We misplace things. We forget. But over the next few days, the key kept moving. It put it back on the hook, only to find it in a different spot the next morning. Sometimes it was on the coffee table. Once, it was on the bathroom sink. Each time, I told myself I was just being forgetful. I wasn't sleeping well. Maybe I was doing these things and not remembering. That's what I told myself. Until the night I woke up to the sound of keys jingling. Not outside. Not in a distant part of the house. Right next to my bed. That night changed everything. I woke up in the middle of the night to the unmistakable sound of metal jingling, a soft clinking, like keys being rattled in someone's hand. It wasn't coming from the front door or the kitchen. It was right next to me. I bolted upright in bed, heart pounding. The room was dark, but I could make out the faint outline of my nightstand. My phone was still there, the glass of water I had placed earlier untouched. The sound stopped the moment I moved. I reached out, fumbling for my bedside lamp, and flipped it on. The warm light flooded the room, casting shadows along the walls. My keys were sitting exactly where I had left them earlier that night, on the dresser across the room. The house key was there too. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Maybe I had dreamed it? Maybe the sound had come from outside? But my windows were closed, and I hadn't heard a car or footsteps. Just the keys. I sat there for a few minutes, waiting, listening. My breathing slowed, but the tension in my chest wouldn't ease. After a while, I turned off the lamp and lay back down. It took forever to fall asleep again. The next morning, I told myself it had been nothing. A half dream, a trick of the mind. Sleep deprivation could do that to a person. I got up, made my coffee, and went through my normal routine, ignoring the tight feeling in my stomach. But as I grabbed my keys from the dresser, I noticed something strange. The house key, my spare, wasn't on the ring anymore. I froze, scanning the surface of the dresser. Nothing. I checked my pockets, the nightstand, even the floor. No key. Panic crept in. I had just seen it there the night before. I had checked, made sure it was in its place. And now, it was gone. I spent nearly an hour searching. I moved furniture, checked drawers I hadn't even opened in weeks. The key was nowhere to be found. A sick feeling twisted in my gut. There was no logical reason for it to be missing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I'd find it later, but the thought nagged at me all day. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I glanced at the bathroom sink, and there it was. The key, sitting right on the porcelain surface, as if someone had carefully placed it there. My stomach dropped. I had searched the bathroom that morning. I had checked the sink, the drawers, even the floor. There was no way I had missed it. I reached for it slowly, my fingers hesitating just above the cold metal. I didn't want to touch it. It felt wrong, like I was playing into something I didn't understand. But I had no choice. I picked it up and turned it over in my palm. It was my key. The same small scratches, the same slightly worn edges. I took it back to the hook by the door and hung it up. That night, I barely slept. Every small noise made my muscles tense. Every creak in the house sent a jolt of unease through me. The next morning, the key was gone again. This time, I didn't even bother searching. I left for work, trying to pretend that nothing was wrong, but my mind kept circling back to the same question. Was I losing it? Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe I was forgetting things more than usual. That's what I told myself. But then it happened again. That evening, I walked through the front door, tossed my bag on the couch, and turned on the kitchen light. And there it was. The key, sitting in the exact center of the counter. I felt my stomach tighten. My hands went clammy. I stood there, staring at it, the air suddenly too thick in my lungs. This wasn't just forgetfulness. This wasn't me misplacing things. Someone or something was moving it. The key moving by itself was disturbing enough, but it was just the beginning. At first, I tried to ignore it. I put the key back on the hook and told myself I wouldn't give it any more attention. But something about that decision made things worse. It was as if whatever was happening didn't want to be ignored. Over the next few days, more things started shifting. My phone charger would be unplugged in the morning, even though I was sure I had plugged it in before bed. The fridge door would be slightly open when I woke up, even though I never left it like that. Small objects, my watch, my wallet, wouldn't be where I had left them the night before. But the key was the worst. It kept appearing in places I knew I hadn't put it. Sometimes I'd find it in my jacket pocket. Other times, on the coffee table. Once, it was balanced perfectly on my pillow when I walked into the bedroom. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence in the house no longer felt peaceful. It felt heavy, charged. The air had weight, like something unseen was pressing down on me. At night, the shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't. I started hearing faint noises, soft clicks, the sound of fabric shifting, like someone moving just out of sight. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it again. The keys. But this time, they weren't jingling on my dresser. They were coming from the living room. I froze, toothbrush still in my mouth, my pulse hammering in my ears. I wasn't imagining it. The sound was clear, metal clicking against itself, slow and deliberate. I swallowed hard and stepped into the hallway, peering toward the living room. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long slashes of dim yellow across the floor. The sound stopped. I stood there, my breath shallow, my skin prickling. I forced myself to walk forward, my bare feet cold against the hardwood. The house was quiet again, but that didn't make me feel any better. I checked the key hook. The spare key was gone. My stomach twisted. I turned on the light, scanning the room. Nothing. No sign of movement, no doors open, no windows unlocked. Then I saw it. The key was on the couch, but it wasn't just sitting there. It was standing upright on its edge. What? I didn't move for a long time. Just stared, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. That was it. I needed to figure out what the hell was going on. The next morning, I started keeping track. I wrote down where I placed the key every night. I took pictures, time-stamping them, making sure I wasn't just misremembering. For the first 2 nights, nothing happened. The key stayed on the hook. My things stayed where I left them. Then, on the 3rd night, I woke up to the sound of something sliding against the floor. My whole body tensed. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, scanning the room. The key was on the floor, not dropped. not randomly placed. It was positioned neatly, parallel to my bed. I stared at it, my mouth dry. This wasn't just some prank. No one had access to my house. I had double-checked the locks. There was no sign of a break-in. Whatever was happening, it was happening inside these walls. The next night, I stayed up. I turned off all the lights, sat in the living room with my back against the couch, and waited. Hours passed. The house was silent. Then, just past 3 a.m., I felt it. A shift in the air. It was subtle, but undeniable, like the temperature had dropped just a few degrees. The hairs on my arms stood up. Then came the sound. A faint click. I turned my head slowly toward the key hook. Empty. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I scanned the room, my pulse racing. And then I saw it. The key was on the coffee table. It hadn't fallen. It had moved. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear anything other than that small metallic click. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, my hands shaking. I took a picture, time-stamped it, then picked up the key. It was ice cold. I didn't sleep that night. The following day, I went to a hardware store and bought a new lock. I switched it out that evening, tossing the old one into the trash outside. I put the spare key back on the hook, determined to put an end to whatever was happening. But that night, things got worse. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to my bedroom door slowly creaking open. I hadn't left it open. My breath caught in my throat. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed thicker, heavier than before. I couldn't see anything, but I felt something. The air was dense, heavy, and then I heard it. A soft, deliberate scraping sound. I reached for my phone, but before I could turn on the flashlight, something fell onto my bed. I flinched, scrambling to sit up, my heart racing. I grabbed my phone and pointed the light down. The key. It was lying right next to me on the blanket. I couldn't move. My fingers clenched the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. My whole body felt frozen, like I was waiting for something else to happen. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at that key, my own breath coming in shallow gasps. Finally, I forced myself to reach out and pick it up. The second my fingers touched it, a soft tap sounded from the hallway. Like something had just taken a step. I snapped my head toward the open door. Nothing. But I knew I wasn't alone. That night was the longest of my life. I sat frozen in my bed, my back pressed against the headboard, the key still clutched tightly in my hand. The silence in the house was overwhelming, but I could hear the sound of my own breathing, ragged, uneven. My skin was damp with sweat, but I felt ice cold inside. That sound from the hallway, that soft tap. It hadn't been my imagination. I wasn't alone. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, to do something, but I was terrified that the moment I made a sound, something, someone would respond. I forced myself to glance at my phone, my fingers trembling as I unlocked the screen. The time read 3:14 a.m. I swallowed hard, my throat painfully dry. I turned the flashlight back on and aimed it at the bedroom doorway. Nothing. The hallway beyond was empty. The shadows stretched long and dark, shifting slightly as the light moved. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing there, watching me. I had to get out. The thought hit me like a slap. I needed to leave. I threw off the blanket, my limbs stiff as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I forced myself to move as quietly as possible, every little creak of the floorboards beneath me making my stomach lurch with fear. I wasn't even sure where I was going. Maybe to the living room. Maybe outside. Just somewhere else. I took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. The house was dead silent. No traffic outside. No hum of the refrigerator. No wind against the windows. It was unnatural. I gripped my phone like a weapon, my thumb hovering over the flashlight icon, afraid that if I turned it off, even for a second, something would move in the dark. I forced myself forward. My heart slammed against my ribs with every step. I could feel the pressure in my ears, the blood rushing through my veins, the shallow rise and fall of my breath. I passed the bathroom, then the second bedroom. The hallway stretched ahead, the living room just a few more steps away. And then, a whisper, low, breathless, right behind me. I whirled around, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The shadows were still. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Then, tap! A single, deliberate footstep from the darkened kitchen. Not a creak. Not a random house noise. A footstep. Someone was there. I turned my phone's flashlight toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the doorway to the kitchen. For a second, I saw nothing. Just the empty space where my dining table should have been. Then, something moved. A shape just beyond the reach of the light. A shadow pulling back, like it had just realized I could see it. I gasped and stumbled backward, my heel catching on the floor. The light from my phone trembled as I raised it higher, my pulse hammering. I aimed it directly into the kitchen. Nothing. The room was empty. No figure. No shadow. But I knew something had been there. My body screamed at me to run, but I stood frozen, my brain trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been a trick of the light? A hallucination? No! Because at that moment, I noticed something on the floor. The key, lying right at the threshold of the kitchen. I hadn't dropped it. I was still holding mine. This was another key, exactly the same as the one I had been finding around my house for days. I took a shaky breath and bent down, my fingers hesitant as they hovered over the metal. The second I touched it, a loud, crashing sound erupted from the living room. I jolted back, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The bookshelf. It had been knocked over, but there was no one there. I spun in a full circle, the beam from my phone shaking as I desperately scanned the house. My heart was racing so fast it felt like it would explode. Then, from somewhere unseen, a voice spoke. Just one word. Low, rough, impossible. Mine. I don't remember running. I don't remember how I got from the hallway to the front door. All I know is that I was suddenly there, my hands fumbling with the locks, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely turn them. The door wouldn't budge. I pulled, yanked, threw my entire weight against it. Locked. No, jammed. Like something on the other side was holding it closed. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I twisted the knob over and over, panic rising in my chest. Behind me, the room had gone silent again. The kind of silence that wasn't empty, but waiting. Then, in the reflection of the glass window on the door, I saw it. Not a person, not a shadow. Something wrong. Something standing at the far end of the hallway, its body slightly too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its arms were at its sides, but the fingers twitched, like it was waiting for me to turn around. I could feel my pulse slamming against my skull, the blood rushing through my veins so fast I thought I might pass out. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I pressed my forehead against the door, my hand still gripping the knob. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to stop. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went quiet. No whispering. No footsteps. No kiss. I turned the knob one last time. And this time, the door opened. I ran. Barefoot, shirt half on. I sprinted down the porch steps and into the street, not stopping until I was halfway down the block. My lungs burned. My vision blurred. I didn't care. I turned back just once. The house was still, the windows dark. There was nothing there. But the weight in the air, the feeling of being watched, hadn't disappeared. It was still there, waiting. And in my clenched fist, slick with sweat, the key was still in my hand. I stood there, barefoot in the middle of the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My pulse throbbed in my ears, and my skin was clammy with cold sweat. I had made it outside. I had escaped. But the weight in my chest told me it wasn't over. The neighborhood was eerily quiet. No passing cars. No distant sounds of late-night television drifting from windows. Just stillness. I turned my head slowly, forcing myself to look back at the house. It sat there like it always had, silent, unmoving, just a regular home in the middle of a normal street. The porch light flickered weakly, casting a dull glow onto the steps. The windows were dark, giving away nothing. But I knew better. I wasn't alone in that house. Something had been there with me. And even though I had made it outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching. My fingers curled tightly around the key in my palm. It was warm, like it had been pressed against skin for too long. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to slow my racing heart. I needed to leave. I needed to get as far away from that house as possible. But where would I go? My car keys were still inside, sitting on the kitchen counter. My wallet, my shoes, my jacket, all still in the house. If I wanted to leave for good, it'd have to go back inside. The thought made my stomach churn. I took a shaky step backward, then another. I could figure that out later. Right now, I just needed to move. So I turned away from the house and started walking. I didn't stop walking until I reached the end of the block. My legs ached, my breath was uneven, and the adrenaline in my veins was starting to wear off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. I needed help. But who was I supposed to call? I pulled my phone from my pocket and stared at the screen. The battery was low, only 6% left. For a split second, I thought about calling someone. A friend, maybe. Or the police. But what would I even say? Hi, I think my house is haunted. They'd either think I was crazy or assume I was having some kind of breakdown. And maybe I was. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the phone. Maybe I should just leave town for a night. Get a motel. Sleep in my car. Just be anywhere but here. I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes darting back to the house. From this distance, it looked completely normal. But I knew better. I turned back to my phone and pulled up the Maps app. The nearest motel was a few miles away. I could walk if I had to. But as I turned onto the next street, something strange happened. The streetlights flickered. Not all at once. One by one. The one ahead of me went dark first, then the next, then the next. It was like something knew where I was going, and it didn't want me to leave. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. This couldn't be real. This had to be exhaustion or stress, or then, just behind me, a sharp metallic sound, like a key scraping against a lock, right next to my ear. I spun around, my chest tightening. The street was empty, but on the pavement, just a few feet away, another key, exactly like the one in my hand. I took a step back, shaking my head. No! No, this wasn't happening. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the gas station at the far end of town. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, casting a harsh, artificial glow over the empty parking lot. I stumbled inside, my legs barely holding me up. The cashier glanced up from his phone, his expression flat. "You okay, man?" he asked. I must have looked insane. Barefoot, covered in sweat, my hands shaking. I swallowed hard, trying to catch my breath. "Yeah," I croaked. Just need a second." I moved to the back of the store, grabbing a bottle of water from the fridge. My reflection in the glass startled me. I looked pale, hollow-eyed, like I hadn't slept in days. I took a shaky sip of water and glanced down at my hand. The key was still there. I had never let go of it. I squeezed my eyes shut and pressed my fingers to my temples. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. I needed to get rid of it. I turned and walked straight to the door, stepping outside into the cold night air. Without thinking, I threw the key as hard as I could into the parking lot. It hit the pavement with a sharp clang, bouncing twice before skidding to a stop near the curb. I watched it for a long moment, waiting. Nothing happened. No flickering lights. No sounds. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe that was it. Maybe it was over. I turned back toward the gas station, ready to go inside. And then, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. A feeling. A presence. I turned my head slowly. The key was no longer on the ground. It was in my other hand, like it had never left. My stomach dropped. I wasn't going to escape this. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. I don't live there anymore. I moved out of that house a long time ago, left town, and tried to start over somewhere new. A place where the air didn't feel heavy, where my shadow didn't feel like it belonged to something else. For a while, I thought distance would be enough. I got rid of everything that reminded me of that place, sold the furniture, threw away the clothes I had worn that night, burned the key. It should have ended there, but it didn't, because some things don't stay behind. Some things follow. At first, it was subtle. A creak in the floorboards when I was home alone. A door that was open when I swore I had closed it. The feeling that someone was right behind me when I turned off the lights at night. I told myself it was paranoia. I told myself that after everything I had been through, my mind was just playing tricks on me. But then the keys started showing up again. Not in the houses this time. Not tucked under pillows or left on counters. They were in places they shouldn't be. One was waiting in my mailbox when I got home from work. Another was sitting in the cup holder of my car when I got in one morning, even though I had locked the doors the night before. The worst was when I found one under my pillow. I had gone to bed like normal, exhausted from a long day. But when I woke up in the middle of the night, I felt something small and cold beneath my head. I reached under my pillow, and there it was. A key, identical to the others. I sat up so fast I nearly fell off the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it's tied to me or if I took something from that house without realizing it. Maybe it was never about the house at all. Maybe I was the one who was haunted. I don't have answers. All I know is that no matter where I go, the keys always find me. And when they do, something changes. The air feels heavier. The shadows stretch a little longer. The nights last just a little bit too long. I still check my pockets before I go to bed. I still lock my doors 3 times. And every morning, before I take a single step out of bed, I check under my pillow. Because if there's a key waiting for me, it means I still haven't escaped. And maybe, just maybe, I never will. The house had its own rhythm. The pipes knocked when the shower ran too long. The winds found its way through the gaps in the old windows, and the stairs creaked in all the same places they always had. It was just background noise, the kind you stop noticing when it's always there. But looking back, I wish I had paid more attention. It was the winter of my senior year when things started to change. The cold seeped into the walls, making every room feel a little too still, a little too heavy. My parents were away for a few months because of work, leaving me to look after my brother. He was in middle school at the time, always glued to his tablet, always dragging his blanket around the house like a security measure. At 16, I barely noticed. I was more focused on school, on college applications, on getting through the last stretch before I could finally leave our quiet town behind. At first, nothing seemed different. My routine stayed the same. Wake up, shovel the driveway if the snow was too high, catch the bus, come home, make sure my brother did his homework, then stay up too late watching videos. It was just us in that house, and it should have been easy. But it never felt empty. I started noticing it at night, after my brother had gone to bed. It'd be in my room, half awake, staring at my phone when it'd hear it, soft, measured steps on the stairs. I'd been hearing those stairs creak my entire life, but something about this was different. The pattern was steady, deliberate, not like the random groans of an old house settling. It sounded like someone was walking. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe my brother had gotten up for a snack. Maybe the house was just reacting to the cold. But every time I checked, he was fast asleep, his door closed, his blankets piled around him like a cocoon. The hallway would be empty, the house silent. It was easy to brush off at first. I wasn't the type to let my mind play tricks on me. But as the nights went on, the sound didn't stop. One night, I stayed up later than usual, buried in a pile of homework I had been putting off. The house was quiet except for the occasional hum of the heating system kicking on. My brother had gone to bed hours ago, and I was the only one still awake. And then, footsteps. This time, I didn't hesitate. I got up, my chair scraping against the floor as I moved. I walked into the hallway, peering down the staircase. The living room below was dark, just the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. I listened, my breath held tight in my chest. Nothing. I waited a few more seconds before shaking my head and heading back to my room. Probably the house settling, I told myself. Nothing to be worried about. I almost convinced myself. The next morning, my brother was quiet at breakfast, pushing his cereal around the bowl without eating much. I barely noticed at first, too focused on running through my schedule for the day. But something about the way he sat there, stiff and uneasy, made me pause. "You good?" I asked, pouring another cup of coffee. He hesitated. "Did you hear something last night?" I felt a prickle of unease crawl up my spine. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, still not looking at me. "Like someone walking around." I forced a laugh. "That's just the house. You know how old it is." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue either. He just nodded, eating a few bites of cereal before pushing the bowl away. The conversation should have ended there. But as I left for school, something made me pause at the bottom of the stairs. A floorboard near the top, one that had never creaked before, let out a low, strained groan. And for the first time, I had to wonder if we were really alone in that house. It wasn't just the footsteps. If it had only been that, I might have ignored it. But little things started shifting, things I couldn't explain away so easily. It started with the door. The first time I noticed, I was getting ready for school. My morning routine was always the same. Wake up, check my phone, force myself out of bed, shower, get dressed, and head downstairs to make sure my brother was actually awake. That morning, everything went as usual, except for one thing. My bedroom door was open. I always slept with it closed. Always. It wasn't something I even thought about. It was just a habit. But when I turned around after grabbing my hoodie off the chair, the door was open about a foot, just wide enough to see into the hallway. I frowned, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way, and the air pressure from the heating system had nudged it open. It was an old house, after all. I didn't think much of it and pulled it shut before heading downstairs. Breakfast was quiet again. My brother barely spoke, his tablet lighting up his face as he scrolled through whatever game he was obsessed with that week. I was halfway through my toast when I caught him glancing at me. "What?" I asked, mouth full. He hesitated, then shook his head. Nothing. I shrugged it off and finished eating, but I noticed something. His door, just like mine, was open. Just a crack. I didn't say anything. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe I had left my door open. Maybe my brother had forgotten to close it all the way. But the next morning, it happened again. And the morning after that. By the third day, I started paying closer attention. Before I went to bed that night, I made sure to shut my door completely. I even pulled on the handle, testing it to make sure it wouldn't drift open. At some point in the night, I woke up. It was the kind of waking that happens suddenly, with no reason. 1 second I was asleep. The next, I was staring at my ceiling, completely alert. Something felt off. The air was colder than usual, like the heating had cut off. I could hear the quiet hum of the house, the faint tick of the clock on my desk. But there was something else. A noise! Soft, slow, a creak. My stomach tightened. I turned my head toward the door, my breath caught in my throat. It was open, wide open. The hallway was dark, stretching out into nothing. My brother's door was just barely visible in the shadows. My fingers tightened around the edge of my blanket, my heart pounding so loudly it was all I could hear. I wanted to get up, to check the hallway, to prove to myself that there was nothing there. But my body didn't move. I just stared, frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to move. I sat up slowly, my skin crawling, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, but I ignored it. I stood, moving carefully, and walked to the door. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, listening. Nothing. I moved to my brother's room, peeking inside. He was asleep, buried under his blankets, his face turned away. His door was open just enough to see in. My chest tightened. I shut his door, then went back to my room and did the same with mine. But this time, I dragged my desk chair over and propped it under the handle. It didn't happen again that night. The next morning, my brother was quieter than usual. He barely touched his breakfast, and when I asked if he was feeling okay, he just nodded without looking up. And then, as I was about to grab my bag and head out the door, he said something that made my stomach drop. I heard footsteps last night. I stopped, turning to him. What? He glanced up, his fingers tightening around his tablet. Someone was walking around. I thought it was you, but you never came to my room. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my hands felt cold. It was probably just the house, I said, forcing a casual tone. He didn't look convinced. I wasn't either. That night, I didn't go to sleep right away. I sat in bed, staring at my door, waiting. The chair was still under the handle, the door firmly shut. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up again. Something had changed. It was the same feeling as before, like being pulled out of sleep without knowing why. I sat up, my heartbeat already picking up. My room was quiet. The air was cold. Then I heard it. A click. My breath caught. I turned my head slowly, my pulse hammering against my ribs. The chair. It had moved. Just an inch. Just enough that the door wasn't completely shut anymore. And then, a single step. Right outside. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The footsteps didn't stop after that night. If anything, they got worse. At first, it was just small things. The occasional sound of movement in the hallway, a door creaking open, that strange coldness in the air that never seemed to go away. But then it started happening earlier in the night. Instead of waking up at some unknown hour to find my door open, I would hear something just as I was about to fall asleep. A faint shift in the floorboards. The slow press of weight against the old wooden steps. I started keeping my lights on. It made no difference. The feeling of being watched became something I couldn't shake. I'd catch myself glancing toward the doorway during the day, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the threshold. At school, I felt distracted, constantly running on too little sleep, my thoughts clouded with something I couldn't explain. And then my brother changed. He stopped playing on his tablet as much. He didn't sit at the table in the morning, choosing instead to eat quickly and disappear into his room. I caught him staring at his door once, his face pale, his fingers twitching slightly like he wanted to get up and close it, but was too afraid to move. One night, I finally asked him, "Have you been hearing anything?" He hesitated, then nodded. My stomach clenched. "Like what?" "Someone walking." His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. "In the hallway." "Sometimes." "In my room." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "In your room?" He nodded again. "I don't see anything, but I feel it." He hesitated, then whispered, "It doesn't like the light." I wanted to tell him he was imagining things, that it was all in our heads. But I couldn't, because I had felt it too. That night, I decided to stay up. I sat on my bed, my phone in my hands, the screen brightness lowered so it wouldn't hurt my eyes. My desk chair was under the door handle again, but I knew it wouldn't matter. It had moved before, and it would move again. I waited. The house settled around me, the usual creaks and groans of an old building shifting in the night. My brother's room was silent. The wind outside rattled against the window. Then, around 2:30 a.m., I heard it. A soft creak. A footstep. I held my breath. My fingers gripped the edge of my blanket. Another step. Slow. Careful. Like something testing the weight of the floor. I stared at the door. The chair hadn't moved. Yet. The steps continued, moving closer. Stopping right outside. The silence was suffocating. Then, the chair slid across the floor. I felt my heart stop. I didn't see it move. I just heard it. The slow, deliberate scrape of wood against wood as it shifted away from the door. My pulse hammered in my ears. My fingers were numb. I couldn't move. Then, the door creaked open. An inch. 2 inches. The hallway beyond was pitch black. I could feel something standing there, watching. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to turn on the lights, to do something, anything. But I didn't. I couldn't. I sat there, my breath shallow, my entire body locked in place. Then, the door slammed shut. Hard. Loud enough that my brother bolted upright in bed in the next room, calling my name in a panicked voice. I scrambled out of bed, throwing the light on. The chair was tipped over on its side. The air felt thick, heavy. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, my brother and I didn't talk about it. We didn't have to. His dark circles and my shaking hands said enough. But I needed answers. So that evening, after school, I started searching. I looked through old documents about the house, newspaper archives, anything I could find online. The house had been built in the late 1800s. It had been passed through different families, changing hands several times. But something stood out, one particular year, a missing person case. A young boy, gone without a trace. His parents had reported that he went missing in the middle of the night. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, just vanished. The last place he had been seen? His bedroom. I felt sick. I didn't want to tell my brother. Not yet. I didn't even know what I believed. But that night, something new happened. At around 3 a.m., my brother screamed. I ran to his room, throwing open the door. He was sitting up in bed, his sheets clutched in his fists, his face pale with terror. "There was someone in my room," he whispered. "They were standing by my bed." I felt my blood turn to ice. I turned on every light I could. The hallway was empty. The room was empty. But the feeling was still there. That heavy, suffocating pressure. Like something was watching, waiting. That night, I refused to sleep. My brother did too. We sat in the living room, the TV on but barely audible, both of us staring at the screen without actually watching. The air in the house felt different, charged, heavy, unnatural. Like something was waiting for us to let our guard down. My brother kept glancing toward the hallway, his fingers gripping the edge of a pillow. I knew he was trying to act like he wasn't scared, but his pale face gave him away. I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what to think anymore. The footsteps, the open doors, the presence in the dark, none of it made sense. And yet, it was all happening. And then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., it started again. A sound from upstairs. A creak. The unmistakable shift of weight on the wooden floor. My brother stiffened. His breathing turned shallow. I turned off the TV. The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating. Another step. Slow, deliberate. The ceiling above us groaned under the pressure. The sound was coming from my room. I swallowed hard. My pulse hammered in my ears. Another step. Closer to the stairs. I clenched my fists. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Someone had broken in? But no. The doors were locked. Windows sealed. Whatever was up, there had always been inside. Then, the stairs creaked. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My brother grabbed my arm, his fingers cold and clammy. We weren't alone. I forced myself to look toward the staircase. The darkness at the top felt different. Deeper. Heavier. As if something was standing there, just out of sight. Waiting. Another step. This time, we both heard it. The unmistakable shift of weight on the second step. I stood up. My breath hitched. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to move. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen counter. My brother shook his head violently, his eyes wide with fear. Don't. His voice was barely a whisper. Just don't. I hesitated. Then, the third step creaked. I clicked the flashlight on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the bottom half of the staircase. Nothing. But the air felt wrong. It pressed against my skin, heavy and suffocating. The hair on my arms stood on end. I took a shaky breath and lifted the flashlight higher. A shadow moved. Not on the stairs. On the ceiling. My throat tightened. It was upside down. I froze. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. The shape of a person, not standing, but clinging to the ceiling. Arms and legs bent at unnatural angles. The head tilted too far to one side. Its eyes were open, watching me. A sharp, sickening jolt of terror shot through my body. My brother gasped behind me, his grip tightening on my arm. The shadow shifted. It moved. Not like a person. Not like anything human. It slithered, fast, straight down the wall. I stumbled backward. The flashlight flickered. The room plunged into darkness. My brother screamed. The sound of movement, rushing, heavy footsteps, coming straight for us. I grabbed his wrist and ran. Through the kitchen, past the dining table, toward the back door. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Behind us, a crash. The sound of something slamming into the floor. We reached the door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking. My brother turned. His eyes widened. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't want to look. I had to. I turned my head, and there it was, standing in the doorway. Not crawling, not moving unnaturally this time. Just standing. Tall. Too tall. Its limbs stretched too long, too thin. And its face, there wasn't one. A hollow, empty void where a mouth should have been. Where eyes should have been. but I knew it was watching. It had always been watching. The lock finally clicked. I wrenched the door open, shoving my brother outside. The cold air hit us like a slap, the night feeling too still, too quiet. I turned back, but the doorway was empty. The house was silent, but the feeling of being watched, that never left. We didn't stop running until we reached the far side of the backyard. The damp grass soaked through my socks, but I barely noticed. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but none of that mattered. My brother bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. His eyes darted between me and the house. What was that? His voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't answer. I couldn't, because there was no answer that made sense. The back door was still wide open. The kitchen light flickered, casting erratic, broken shadows inside. But nothing moved. Nothing came after us. The street beyond the yard was empty. No cars, no neighbors. Just silence, heavy and unnatural. I pulled out my phone and called the police. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped it. The dispatcher answered, but I barely managed to form a coherent sentence. Someone was in our house. That's all I could say. They told us to stay outside and wait. So we did. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours. The entire time, I refused to look at the windows. I felt it. Something watching. But not from inside. From the roof. I didn't dare confirm it. I just stared at the pavement, gripping my brother's arms so tightly he winced. The wail of sirens finally broke the silence. 2 officers arrived, their flashlights cutting through the dark as they made their way toward the open door. Stay here, one of them instructed before stepping inside. The wait was unbearable. I kept expecting to hear shouting, gunfire, anything. Instead, there was only silence. Then, after several agonizing minutes, they returned. Nothing. No intruder. No signs of forced entry. No footprints. Nothing out of place, except for the fact that every single door and window upstairs was wide open. And my room? My room was ice cold. The officer who checked it said the temperature dropped the moment he stepped inside. He asked if I had left the windows open earlier. I told him no. They searched the entire house, attic included, but there was no one there. No proof of anything at all. It didn't make sense. One officer pulled me aside and asked if I was under stress, if maybe my mind had conjured up something out of fear. I wanted to argue, but what could I say? The thing we saw, the way it moved, the way it stood, the way it made the entire house feel wrong, none of that could be explained. The police left after making a report. They told us to lock the doors and call again if anything happened. But I knew they wouldn't come back for shadows. And that's exactly what it was. A shadow! That night, we didn't go back inside. Instead, we sat in the car, parked just beyond the driveway, waiting for the sun to rise. Neither of us spoke. We just watched the house. And every so often, I saw movement in the upstairs window. The sun rose slowly, casting a dull, grayish light over the house. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight pressing down on my chest loosened, but it didn't disappear. We sat there in the car, exhausted, drained, and unable to process what had happened. My brother hadn't spoken since the police left. He just kept staring at the house, his fingers tapping anxiously on his knee. Eventually, I turned to him. "We're not staying here." He nodded without hesitation. We went inside only to grab the essentials, clothes, wallets, chargers. Even in daylight, the house felt off. The air was thick, stale, like something had settled in, watching, waiting. I didn't look at the stairs. Didn't look at the ceiling. Didn't check my room. I just packed as fast as I could and got out. We drove to our parents' house on the other side of town. The moment we stepped inside, it felt like we had escaped something. But the fear, that didn't leave. It clung to us like an invisible weight. Neither of us talked about what we saw, what we knew we saw. Days passed, then a week. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow on the ceiling. The way it moved, the way it watched. I kept checking my phone, waiting for some kind of news. A break in a police update. Anything. But nothing happened. Nothing at all. It was as if the house had swallowed the truth whole. Then, one night, I got a call. The landlord. He asked if we had forgotten to lock the windows before we left. I gripped my phone tighter. What do you mean? The neighbors called me, he said. They swear they keep seeing the upstairs windows open at night. But every time I come to check, they're shut. A cold chill crawled up my spine. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay even. Did you see anything? A pause. Then, quietly, no. Another pause. Then, but it feels different in there. I didn't respond. Because I already knew. I never went back. Not once. A few months later, someone else moved in. I checked the listing obsessively, waiting to see if it would go back on the market. It never did. And I never found out what happened to them. But sometimes, late at night, when the silence stretches too long, when the shadows seem too thick, I wonder. Because whatever was in that house, it never needed a door to find us. It wasn't some decaying mansion with a tragic history or a forgotten relic tucked away in the woods. It was a simple, two-story house built in the early 1900s, nestled between newer developments that made it seem out of place. The house had charm, the kind that made it feel like home despite its age. A wraparound porch, tall windows, and a front yard that was just big enough to need mowing every weekend. I had recently started working remotely, and the idea of getting a quiet place away from the city was too good to pass up. It wasn't far from civilization, just a 15-minute drive to the nearest grocery store. But at night, when the streets emptied and the distant hum of traffic faded, the silence felt heavy. I moved in alone. No roommates, no pets. Just me, a couple of boxes, and a coffee maker that worked harder than it should have. I was in my late 20s, single, and used to solitude, so the idea of living alone didn't bother me. In fact, I welcomed it. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time settling in, unpacking boxes, and making the place feel like mine. The previous owner had left behind a few antique pieces, a weathered wooden dresser, an old mirror in the hallway, and a grandfather clock that, despite being unplugged, still ticked faintly as if it had a life of its own. The neighborhood was quiet. My nearest neighbor was a retired man who mostly kept to himself. I saw him sometimes, sitting on his porch, watching the street with the stillness of someone who had seen it all. He nodded when I waved, but never said much. My daily routine was simple. Wake up, make coffee, work at my desk near the large bay window, and spend my evenings either reading or watching old movies. Nothing about my life was exciting, and I liked it that way. At night, the house felt different. Not in a bad way, just different. The air seemed heavier. The walls seemed to hold on to sounds longer than they should. I chalked it up to being in an old house. Old houses make noise. Wood contracts. Pipes settle. There was always a reason. But as the days passed, the silence of the house started to feel less like peace and more like something watching. I never heard anything out of the ordinary. No footsteps, no voices, just the occasional creak or groan that could be easily explained. Still, there was something about the way the air felt at night, like the house itself was holding its breath. One evening, I sat in the living room, flipping through a book, when I noticed something strange. The grandfather clock in the hallway, it had stopped ticking. I hadn't touched it, hadn't wound it. It had been ticking softly since I moved in, a steady, rhythmic sound that faded into the background. And now, silence. I walked over, placing my hand on the clock's wooden frame. It was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. I pressed my ear to the glass, listening for any faint movement inside. Nothing. I told myself it had simply stopped working, that old clocks do that. But for some reason, I felt uneasy. I left it alone, walked back to the couch, and tried to focus on my book. Minutes passed. Then, just as I had started to relax, the ticking started again. Loud. Slow. As if something inside the clock had woken up. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced myself to ignore it. The house was old. Things like this happened. Or at least, that's what I told myself. That was the first time I felt like I wasn't alone. I should have left the house that night, but I didn't, and I would regret that decision more than anything. The night the clock started ticking again, I should have trusted my instincts. Something about it felt wrong, like the house itself had decided to remind me it was still alive. But I did what most people would do. I shrugged it off, told myself I was being ridiculous, and went to bed. I barely slept. The sound of the clock echoed in my head long after I had turned off the lights. I had lived alone before, but something about this house made the nights stretch longer than they should. I woke up feeling groggy, my body heavy with exhaustion, and convinced myself that the stress of moving and adjusting to a new place was making me overthink things. That morning, I went about my usual routine: coffee, work, answering emails. The house was quiet again. No strange noises, no more unexpected ticking from the clock. It was almost enough to make me believe I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. That afternoon, while sitting at my desk, I heard something strange. A faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just something outside, a branch against the window, maybe. But as I kept listening, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the walls. The sound was soft at first, barely noticeable over the hum of my laptop. But once I focused on it, I couldn't ignore it. Tap, tap, tap. I stood up, pressing my ear to the wall near my desk. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was on the other side trying to get my attention. I told myself it was just an old house settling. That's what old houses do. They make noise. But deep down, I knew this was different. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, like a pattern. I knocked back against the wall without thinking, just 3 quick taps. A ridiculous gesture, an attempt to prove to myself that it was nothing. For a few seconds, nothing happened. And then, 3 taps back. I stumbled backward so fast I nearly knocked over my chair. My breath caught in my throat, my skin crawling with something I couldn't explain. It had answered. I stood there, frozen, waiting to hear something else. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. The only sound in the room was the faint buzzing of my computer. I should have packed a bag right then and left, but I didn't. Instead, I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe there were pipes running through the walls. Maybe a bird had gotten trapped somewhere. Something logical. I spent the next hour trying to find an answer. I knocked on different parts of the wall, listened for any changes in sound. I even went outside to check if a branch could be causing it. Nothing. The walls were solid, no signs of pipes or animals. By evening, I had managed to push it to the back of my mind. Maybe I had imagined the taps. Maybe it was just coincidence. I had barely slept the night before, after all, so I did my best to shake it off. I made dinner, watched a few episodes of some mindless show, and tried to distract myself. That night, as I lay in bed, I told myself it was over, that whatever had happened was just a trick of my mind. Then, just as sleep started to take over, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time. Closer. I sat up so fast my heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. The room was dark, but I could feel it, the weight of something unseen, pressing against the silence. I held my breath, straining to hear. Nothing. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening for anything else. But the tapping never came again. Not that night. But I knew, whatever this was, it wasn't done with me yet. And I was right. The tapping became a part of my nights. It never happened during the day, never when I was working or moving around the house. It waited until the sun dipped below the horizon, until the house was bathed in darkness, until I was lying in bed, vulnerable. It never followed the same pattern. Sometimes it was soft, distant, like it was coming from deep within the walls. Other times it was sharp and deliberate, as if it was right behind my headboard. I tried to ignore it, to pretend it wasn't happening, but it was getting harder. Sleep became something I dreaded. I found myself staying up later, keeping lights on, playing white noise through my phone just to block out the possibility of hearing it. It didn't work. One night, about a week after the first incident, I had dozed off with my laptop still open beside me. I wasn't fully asleep, just in that hazy space between wakefulness and dreaming when the sound came again. Not tapping this time. A scraping noise, like fingernails dragging against wood. My entire body tensed. My eyes snapped open, but I didn't move. I just listened. The sound was coming from the wall near my closet. Slow, deliberate. A long, drawn-out scrape followed by silence. Then again. Closer this time. I sat up, heart pounding. The room was dimly lit by the glow of my laptop screen. My closet door was slightly ajar, just enough to show the darkness inside. The scraping had stopped, but the air in the room felt thick, heavy, charged with something unseen. I forced myself to move, to swing my legs over the side of the bed. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to not open the closet, to just leave it alone. But I couldn't. I reached out, gripping the edge of the door with shaky fingers, and pulled it open. Nothing. Just clothes, shoes, and a few unpacked boxes. I let out a breath, almost laughing at myself. My exhaustion was turning into paranoia. And then, thud. A single, heavy knock from inside the wall. I stumbled backward, my stomach twisting in pure dread. It wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from behind it. I stood frozen, staring at the wall. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. The knock had been loud, solid, like something was inside the wall, trying to get out. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided I needed answers. I started by checking the house's blueprints. The real estate agent had emailed them to me when I first bought the place, and I had barely glanced at them. Now, I combed through every detail, trying to understand the layout. There shouldn't have been anything behind that closet wall. It was supposed to be solid, just part of the house structure. But then, I noticed something. There was an odd gap between my closet wall and the next room over. A space that shouldn't have existed. A crawl space. I spent the next hour searching for an entrance. The house had an attic, but when I checked, there was no clear way to access the space between the walls. The basement was the same, unfinished, mostly empty, with no visible access points. But there had to be a way in. I started knocking on the walls, listening for any hollow spots. When I reached the back of my closet, my knuckles met something different. A hollow sound. I pressed my palm against it, feeling a slight give. The paint was uneven here, like someone had patched something over. My pulse hammered in my ears. I didn't want to open it, but I needed to know. I grabbed a small hammer from my toolbox and started chipping away at the plaster. The more I peeled back, the more I realized this wasn't just a wall. It was a door. A hidden door. It had been sealed up, covered with drywall and paint to blend in. Someone had gone through a lot of effort to make sure it was never opened again. But why? I hesitated. Every part of me was screaming to stop, to leave it alone. But I had to know. I wedged the claw of the hammer into the edge of the panel and pulled. With a groan, the makeshift wall gave way, revealing a narrow, pitch-black space behind it. The air that rushed out smelled wrong, stale, thick with dust and something else. Something that made my stomach turn. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it into the opening. The space was barely wide enough for a person to stand in. It stretched down the length of the wall, disappearing into darkness. The wooden beams were rough, covered in deep scratches, like something had clawed at them. And then I saw them. Footprints. Not old, faded ones. Fresh, leading from the far end of the crawl space. Toward me. I staggered backward, nearly dropping my phone. My breath came in ragged gasps. Someone had been in there. Or worse, someone was still in there. I spun around, grabbed the closet door, and slammed it shut. Then, from inside the crawl space, I heard it. Tap, 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 right against the other side of the wall. I locked the closet door, shoved my dresser in front of it, and backed away, my entire body shaking. Something was in this house with me, and it wasn't hiding anymore. The tapping stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. I stood frozen in the middle of my room, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. My breath came fast and uneven, the sound of it too loud in the suffocating stillness. I wanted to believe I had imagined it, that my exhaustion, my stress, all of it had made me hear something that wasn't real. But I hadn't imagined the footprints. I hadn't imagined the hidden crawl space. And I definitely hadn't imagined the way the tapping had followed me across the walls. I forced myself to move, to break free from the paralysis of fear gripping my body. My first instinct was to get out, just leave, drive to a hotel, and figure everything out in the morning. But something kept me there. A sick curiosity, a need to understand what was happening before I ran. I grabbed my phone again, turned on the flashlight, and pointed it toward the closet door. I had barricaded it with my dresser, but now that seemed like a mistake. If something was inside those walls, trapped, what if I was only making it worse? No, that was ridiculous. There was no logical explanation for any of this. And yet, thud, a single, heavy knock from inside the closet. I flinched, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I couldn't. I swallowed hard, forcing down the panic rising in my throat. My hands shook as I reached for the dresser, dragging it away from the closet door. The sound of wood scraping against the floor made me wince, but I didn't stop. When the dresser was clear, I gripped the closet door handle and hesitated. My fingers were ice cold. A voice in my head screamed, "Don't open it." But another part of me, the same part that had led me to break open the crawl space, needed to know. With a deep breath, I turned the handle. The door creaked open. Darkness. I lifted my phone, shining the flashlight inside. The closet looked normal, clothes hanging neatly, boxes stacked against the back wall. But the hidden door was still there, slightly ajar from when I had broken it open. I took a slow step forward. The air inside the closet was even colder than the rest of the room, and the stench of dust and decay was overwhelming. My fingers brushed against my jacket sleeve as I moved aside a few hanging clothes, clearing my view of the crawl space. And that's when I saw it. The handprint. A single, smudged handprint on the inside of the crawl space door. Not old, faded with time. Fresh. Like someone had pressed their palm against the wood from the inside. I stumbled back so fast I nearly fell. My flashlight wavered, casting jagged shadows against the walls. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. That was enough. I was done. I spun around and bolted for the door. I had to get out now. But just as I reached the threshold of my room, the closet door slammed shut behind me. I screamed. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was something else. I ran. Down the hall, down the stairs, gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe until I was outside, standing in my driveway, gasping for air. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent. But I wasn't alone. Someone was in there, and they didn't want me to leave. I grabbed my keys from my pocket with shaking hands, yanked open my car door, and threw myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and tore out of the driveway without a second thought. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked in a gas station lot with my hands still gripping the steering wheel so tightly they felt numb. My mind raced. My thoughts spiraled. None of this made sense. But as I sat there, my body still trembling with adrenaline, one thought pushed through the haze of panic. I had left the house empty. The only person inside was me. So who and what closed the closet door? And why did it feel like it wasn't over yet? I sat in my car for what felt like hours, parked under the flickering lights of an old gas station. My hands still gripped the steering wheel, stiff from how hard I had been squeezing it. My breath had slowed, but my heart hadn't caught up yet. I kept replaying it all in my head. The handprint, the closet door slamming shut, the footsteps in the walls. Every part of me wanted to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just my imagination. But I knew better. Something was in that house, and I had left it behind. But even as I sat there, miles away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with me yet. After a while, I forced myself to take a deep breath and pulled out my phone. My fingers were shaking as I scrolled through my contacts, debating who to call. The police? What would I even say? That my house had a hidden crawl space and strange noises in the walls? That I found a fresh handprint where no one should have been? I knew how that conversation would go. They'd tell me it was nothing, that houses made noises, that I was just stressed. But I knew what I heard. I swallowed hard and dialed the only person I thought might take me seriously, my old friend, Matt. He lived about 40 minutes away, and though we hadn't talked much in the last year, he was one of the few people who wouldn't immediately dismiss me as paranoid. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. "Dude, do you have any idea what time it is?" His voice was groggy, but I didn't care. I need a place to stay. My own voice sounded foreign, shaking more than I wanted it to. That woke him up. Wait, what? What happened? I hesitated. How much should I tell him? Something's wrong with my house, I finally said. I don't know how to explain it, but I can't stay there tonight. A pause. Then, without questioning me, he said, Come over. I'll keep the door unlocked. Relief flooded through me, but it didn't erase the fear curling in my gut. I thanked him, hung up, and started driving. The whole way there, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone in my back seat. But the car was empty. At least, it looked empty. More questions than answers. When I finally got to Matt's place, he was already waiting by the door, dressed in sweats and looking concerned. Dude, you look like hell, he said as I stepped inside. I didn't even argue. I just nodded and sank onto his couch, still feeling like my legs weren't fully under me. He sat across from me, studying me for a moment before asking, You want to tell me what's going on? I opened my mouth, then closed it. How was I supposed to explain this? Finally, I just told him everything. The noises, the tapping, the hidden crawl space, the handprint. Matt didn't interrupt. He just listened, his expression unreadable. When I was finished, he let out a low breath and leaned back in his chair. That's messed up, he finally said. So what now? That was the question, wasn't it? What now? I had no intention of going back there alone. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. But part of me needed to know what was going on. I needed answers. Maybe he'll get someone to check the crawl space, I muttered. A contractor or an inspector or something. Someone who can tell me if there's any logical explanation for what's been happening. Matt nodded slowly. That's probably smart. But, he hesitated. If there's not a logical explanation, then what? I had no idea. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the conversation settling between us. Finally, Matt clapped his hands together and stood up. All right, we'll deal with this in the morning. You can crash here tonight. I nodded, too drained to argue. But even as I tried to sleep, stretched out on his couch, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. The night passed without incident. No tapping, no knocking, no unseen footsteps. But when I woke up the next morning, something didn't feel right. At first, I couldn't place it. The room looked normal. The sun was shining through the blinds. Matt was already awake, standing in the kitchen, making coffee. Then I noticed my phone. It was sitting on the coffee table, exactly where I had left it. But the screen was on, and there was a new recording open. I frowned, picking it up. I didn't remember recording anything. I clicked play. At first, there was nothing but static. A low, humming noise that almost sounded like breathing. Then, a faint tapping. My stomach clenched. The tapping grew louder, slow and deliberate. And then, a voice. A whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. You shouldn't have left. I dropped the phone. My breath came short, my hands numb. Matt must have noticed my reaction because he called over, Hey, you good? I couldn't answer. I just stared at the phone, my mind racing. I had locked the doors. I had turned off my phone before going to sleep. And yet, somehow, it recorded something. And whatever had spoken those words, it knew I had left. I didn't go back to the house. Not that day. Not the next. Honestly, I wasn't sure if I ever would. After hearing that voice on the recording, something inside me shifted. Up until that point, part of me had been holding on to the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was some rational explanation. Maybe my mind had been playing tricks on me. Maybe the house had strange acoustics. Maybe there was some logical reason for the noises, the tapping, the crawl space. But that recording, There was no explaining that. It meant that something knew I had left, and it didn't sound happy about it. Matt tried to talk me into going back, just once, to at least grab my essentials, clothes, personal items, anything important. But I couldn't do it. I knew it didn't make sense. It was just a house, right? 4 walls, a roof, and a foundation. Whatever had been in there couldn't follow me. It shouldn't have been able to reach me once I left. But it did, through my phone, through a recording that shouldn't have existed. And that meant I wasn't safe. Not really. So I did the only thing I could do. I put the house up for sale. It was impulsive, sure. And I knew it would take time, but I didn't care. I couldn't live there. I couldn't even step foot in that place again. Whatever was in those walls, whoever had been trapped inside that crawl space, I wasn't going to be the one to deal with it. I signed the papers, handed everything over to an agent, and left town for a while. But even as I tried to move on, something gnawed at me. A question I couldn't shake. Who had been in the house with me? I had spent weeks thinking it was just me in that house, living alone, going about my daily life. But the signs had been there all along, the food going missing, the tapping, the shadows in the corners of my vision. There had been someone else. Maybe it was just a person, a squatter who had found a way into the walls, someone who had been living there in secret, unnoticed. But if that was the case, why hadn't they just left? Why the tapping? The whispers? Why did it feel like they wanted me to know they were there? And more importantly, why did they wait until I was alone to let me hear them? Months passed, and I moved into a small apartment across the city. No more creaking walls, no hidden crawl spaces, no strange noises in the middle of the night. For the first time in a long time, I could actually sleep. I blocked the house out of my mind. Or at least, I tried to. But sometimes, late at night, I would wake up in a panic, convinced I had heard tapping on my bedroom wall. It'd lie there, heart pounding, staring at the ceiling, waiting to hear it again. It never came. But the feeling, that awareness, never fully left me. Then, one day, my real estate agent called. "Good news," she said. "The house is finally under contract." I should have felt relieved. I should have been happy. But instead, my stomach twisted. Someone else was going to move in. Someone else was going to hear the tapping. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. It was an old house, built sometime in the 50s. The walls had a certain warmth, like they had soaked up decades of life within them. There were a few cracks here and there, but nothing out of the ordinary. The landlord had warned me about the pipes making noise at night, but other than that, he assured me it was a sturdy little place. I had moved in during late autumn, just as the trees were shedding their last leaves. The days were getting shorter, and by the time I got home from work, it was already dark. My job wasn't anything thrilling. I worked in an office, the kind where hours slipped by unnoticed in the glow of a computer screen. I had my usual routine. Wake up early, drive to work, come home, make dinner, and unwind with a book or some mindless scrolling on my phone. At first, everything felt normal. The house was cozy in its own way, despite the occasional draft that snuck through the old windows. I got used to the quirks, the way the floor groaned under my weight, the way the kitchen light flickered if I left it on too long. It was just an old house, I told myself. But looking back, I wonder if I ignored the small signs. The little things that seemed off, but never enough to make me question my own sense of reality. Like the first night I slept there. I remember waking up around 3 a.m., not sure why. The room was quiet, too quiet, and there was this strange feeling in my chest, like I had been pulled out of a deep sleep for a reason. I told myself it was just the new environment messing with my mind. But then I heard it, just the faintest sound, like something shifting inside the walls. I sat up, listening. It wasn't the pipes. I knew what those sounded like. This was different. A dull thud, then silence. I held my breath, waiting for it to happen again. But the house stayed quiet. After a few minutes, I forced myself to lay back down, telling myself it was nothing. Houses settle. Old wood creaks. Still, I slept with the lights on for the rest of the week. Days went by, and I settled into my usual patterns. Wake up, work, home. The sounds didn't happen again, at least, not when I was awake to hear them. I started to convince myself that it had been a one-time thing, that maybe I had dreamed it. Everything was fine. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Then one night, I was sitting on the couch, half watching something on TV while eating dinner. The only light in the room came from the screen, casting a flickering glow across the walls. I had started feeling comfortable in the house, enough that the uneasiness from that first night had faded. And then it happened again. A sound, soft, faint, like someone shifting their weight against the wall. I turned the volume down, holding my breath. Silence! I tried to shake it off, but something about it didn't feel right. The house had been still just moments before, but now it felt different, like I wasn't alone. I got up, walked over to the wall where I thought the sound had come from, and pressed my hand against it. The surface was cool under my fingers, solid, normal. Maybe I was just overthinking things. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. And then, as if to prove my worst fear right, a sound, not loud, not obvious, just soft enough to make my stomach drop. A voice, not from inside the room, from inside the wall. I lay there in bed, heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. The sound I had just heard, it hadn't been the creak of an old house settling, nor the hum of the pipes. It had been something else. It had been a voice. A muffled, distant whisper pressed into the walls like someone was speaking just on the other side of them. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. Maybe I had been half asleep, maybe I had been dreaming. But I knew that wasn't true. I had been awake, and I had heard something. My body felt frozen in place, but my mind was racing. I needed to do something, turn on the light, get up, check the room, anything to remind myself that I was alone. But part of me didn't want to move, because if I did, if I acknowledged it, then I was admitting that something was really wrong. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. And then, a soft tap. Just once, right against the wall behind my bed. I sat up so fast my vision blurred. The sound had come from inside the wall. Not the other side of it, inside it. I turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room in warm yellow light. My eyes darted to the wall, searching for something, anything that could explain what I had just heard. Nothing. Just smooth drywall, slightly faded from age, with no cracks or marks. I swallowed hard, forcing my breathing to slow. Maybe it was an animal, a rat in the walls, or even a bird trapped somewhere in the attic. That had to be it. But even as I tried to make sense of it, my gut told me I was lying to myself. I got out of bed, moving cautiously across the room. I pressed my ear to the wall, listening. Silence! No scratching, no rustling, no movement. Nothing. I stood there for a long time, waiting for the noise to return. But it didn't. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing. After a while, I pulled away and shook my head. This was ridiculous. I was working myself up over nothing. I was tired. My mind was playing tricks on me, and that was all there was to it. Still, I didn't turn the light off when I got back into bed. I stared at the ceiling, forcing myself to focus on the hum of the heater kicking on, the occasional gust of wind outside. Normal sounds, safe sounds, sounds I could explain. Eventually, exhaustion won. My eyes grew heavy, and despite the unease coiling in my stomach, I let sleep pull me under. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy, my head thick with the weight of restless sleep. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes. For a moment, I had almost forgotten about the night before. Almost. But then I looked at the wall, and I saw something that hadn't been there before. A small, almost imperceptible dent, right where I had heard the tapping. I stared at it, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Had it always been there? Had I just never noticed it? I reached out and ran my fingers over the surface. The drywall felt smooth, but the dent was unmistakable. It wasn't deep, barely more than a shallow impression, but it was there. I frowned, stepping back. Maybe I had leaned against it too hard the night before, or maybe I had bumped it without realizing it. That had to be it. But something about it felt wrong. The placement of it, the way it was perfectly level with where my head had been while I slept. Like someone, had pressed against the other side. I tried to shake off the feeling creeping up my spine. I had things to do. I couldn't waste time getting caught up in my own paranoia. I forced myself into my routine. Shower, coffee, breakfast, normal things. Things that grounded me in reality. By the time I left for work, I had almost convinced myself that the night before had been nothing more than an overactive imagination and a coincidence. Almost. That night, I hesitated before turning the lights off. I stood by the switch, staring at the shadows stretching across the floor, the corners of the room darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. The dent in the wall was still there, small, barely noticeable, but my eyes kept drifting back to it. I turned away and climbed into bed, telling myself I was being ridiculous. The room settled into its usual nighttime quiet. The faint hum of the heater, the distant sound of cars passing on the main road. I closed my eyes, forcing my body to relax. Minutes passed, then an hour. Then, tap! My eyes snapped open. The same spot, the same rhythm, a deliberate, almost testing sound. I held my breath, every muscle in my body going rigid. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, and then, ever so faintly, a voice. Not a full sentence, just a single word. The sound was muffled, almost as if it was being pressed through layers of fabric or drywall. My blood ran cold. I threw the blankets off and turned the light on so fast my fingers fumbled against the switch. The sudden brightness made my vision blur, but I didn't care. I turned to the wall, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the smooth, unbroken surface of the drywall. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. My breathing was shaky, my skin clammy. I wasn't imagining this. Something was in the walls, and it was trying to get my attention. For a long time, I just stood there, the light buzzing softly above me, my pulse hammering in my ears. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I pressed my palm against the wall, feeling for vibrations, for warmth, for anything. It was cold, solid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just beyond it. Something waiting, something listening. I backed away, my hands clenched into fists. This wasn't normal. This wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. Something was wrong with this house. And for the first time since moving in, I started to wonder if I had made a mistake coming here. I didn't sleep much after that night. Every little noise, every shift in the air, every creak of the house put me on edge. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that old houses made sounds, that the mind played tricks in the dark, but I wasn't fooling myself anymore. Something was wrong. And whatever it wasn't stopping. For the next few nights, the tapping returned. Always in the same spot, right at the head of my bed. Sometimes soft, like fingers drumming lightly on the drywall. Other times, it was sharp and deliberate, like something trying to get my attention. I stopped sleeping with the lights off. It didn't make me feel safer, but at least I could see my surroundings. I needed to know if something moved, if something changed. And then the whispering started. At first, it was just a faint murmur. Indistinct. A sound so soft I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. But then, one night, as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I heard it clearly. 2 words. Come back. My whole body locked up. The voice was low, pressed into the wall, as if someone was speaking directly from the other side of it. I sat up so fast the mattress creaked beneath me. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the wall. Nothing, but the air felt charged, like I wasn't alone. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to breathe. I needed to do something. I couldn't just sit there, night after night, waiting for whatever this was to get worse. So I made a decision. The next day, I was going to check the walls. I spent most of the following afternoon moving furniture, inspecting every inch of the drywall. I knocked against different areas, listening for hollow spaces, checking for cracks or holes. Nothing seemed out of place until I reached the spot behind my bed. The sound was different here. The knock didn't echo the way it did on the other walls. It sounded thicker, like there was something on the other side. I pressed my palm against it. The drywall was smooth, cool, normal. But then, as I pulled my hand away, something happened that sent a jolt of ice down my spine. The wall exhaled. It wasn't a gust of air. It wasn't a draft. It was a long, slow breath, like something had pressed its mouth against the other side and sighed out against the surface. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. No, that wasn't possible. That didn't make sense. I turned on my phone's camera and hit record, pointing it at the wall. I stood there, waiting, barely daring to breathe. Minutes passed. Nothing. And then, a sound, so faint I barely caught it. A whisper. But this time, it wasn't words. It was laughter. Low, amused, almost knowing. I bolted from the room. I spent the next hour pacing the living room, phone clutched in my hands, heart hammering in my chest. I played the video back, watching the screen closely, listening through my headphones. And there it was. The breath. The laughter. It was real. I wasn't losing my mind. Something was in the walls. Something was aware of me. And worst of all, it was enjoying this. The next night, I refused to sleep in my bedroom. I set up camp in the living room, keeping the TV on for background noise. I told myself that it was just for one night, that I just needed space to clear my head. But deep down, I knew I was scared. And then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the tapping started again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the wall behind my bed. It was coming from the wall in the living room. right next to me. I turned my head slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. The tapping was coming from inside the drywall, just inches away from where I sat. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, intentional. A pattern. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Tap. A longer pause. Then, scratch. My breath hitched. The sound wasn't frantic or desperate, like an animal trapped inside the walls. It was slow, deliberate. It wanted me to hear it. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and hit record again, pointing the camera toward the wall. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Silence!" I swallowed hard, waiting. And then, just as I was about to shut the camera off, a single, drawn-out tap. Like an answer. By now, I knew this wasn't a case of old pipes or a settling house. This was something else. Something intelligent. Something playing with me. I needed to know more. So the next day, I did some research. I pulled up old records of the house, trying to find any history that might explain what was happening. Deaths, disappearances, anything. And then I found it. The house had been built in the 1940s. Over the years, multiple owners had come and gone. Most stayed for no more than a few years. A few had even left suddenly, breaking their leases without explanation. But there was one case that stood out. A man had gone missing. His name wasn't in the reports. There were no police records, no missing persons case. Just a brief mention in a newspaper clipping. Local man disappears from his home on Grove Street. Neighbors report strange noises in the walls before his disappearance. Authorities found no signs of forced entry. Case remains unsolved. I felt sick. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen, my pulse thudding in my ears. Strange noises in the walls. Just like now. My stomach turned as a terrible thought crossed my mind. What if he hadn't disappeared? What if he was still here? Not alive, not in the way I was, but trapped. Inside the walls. That night, I stayed awake, listening. I needed proof. I set my phone to record, placed it against the wall, and waited. The tapping started again, but this time, it was different. More frantic. Like it knew what I had found. I clenched my fists, trying to stay calm. "What do you want?" I asked. A long silence. Then, in the quiet, "Help!" My whole body went rigid. The voice was clearer this time. A whisper, but urgent. I grabbed my phone, my fingers ice cold. "How?" I whispered back. "Silence!" Then, a slow, scraping sound, like fingernails dragging against the wood behind the drywall. I pressed my hand against the surface, my breath shallow. The air felt thick, heavy. Then, just as I was about to pull away, a single, deafening bang shook the wall. I jumped back, my heart slamming into my ribs. The house fell silent again. But in that silence, I knew one thing. This wasn't going to stop. It was only getting worse. That night, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat on the couch, my phone still clutched in my hand, staring at the recording I had just made. The voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just a sound, not some trick of old pipes or settling wood. It was a plea. "Help me." I played it over and over again, each time feeling my stomach tighten, my throat dry out. I had proof now. Proof that something, someone, was in my walls. But what the hell was I supposed to do? I considered calling someone, police, a paranormal investigator, even a contractor to check the house structure. But how was I supposed to explain it? "Hey, I think there's something living in my walls, and it talks to me at night." No one would believe me. Hell, I didn't even want to believe myself. But then, just as I was about to turn my phone off and force myself to sleep, it happened. The tapping started again. Only this time, it wasn't just on one wall. It was everywhere, all around me, above me, below me, a chorus of taps, scratches, and something even worse, breathing. Heavy, labored breaths, pressing through the walls like they weren't even solid. I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end. My chest felt tight, like something was pressing against me. I gripped the couch, my eyes darting around the room. Then, bang! A violent slam against the living room wall. I jumped to my feet. Bang! Another one, this time from the hallway. The house shook. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The tapping had turned into pounding, angry, relentless. It wasn't just trying to get my attention anymore. It was demanding something. And then, the whisper returned. But it wasn't a plea this time. It was a command. Open it. A chill ran through me so fast I almost collapsed. My breathing came in short, panicked bursts. Open it. It was coming from inside the wall again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. There were two. One whispering, desperate. The other, laughing. I turned slowly, my eyes locked onto the section of the wall where I had first heard the noises. My mind screamed at me to run, to leave, to get out of this house and never look back. But something stronger held me in place. I had to know. I don't even remember grabbing the crowbar. One moment, I was standing in my living room, paralyzed by fear. The next, I was in my bedroom, my hands gripping the cold metal, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tapping had stopped. The whispering had stopped. But the presence hadn't left. I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. I swallowed hard, raising the crowbar. The drywall in front of me looked no different than before, just a plain, slightly faded section of the room. But I knew better now. I knew it was hiding something. I hesitated for only a second. Then, with a sharp exhale, I drove the crowbar into the wall. Crack! The drywall split. A thin line tore through the surface, dust and bits of paint crumbling to the floor. I pulled back and struck again. Crack! A hole started to form. The air that seeped out stank like old wood, mildew, and something else. Something rotting. I coughed, my stomach twisting, but I didn't stop. Another hit. Another. The hole grew bigger. Then, as I pulled back for one final strike, something moved inside. I froze. A shadow. Small. Twitching. Shifting. My breath caught in my throat. And then, a hand. Pale. Thin. Clawing through the hole. I stumbled back so fast I nearly tripped. My body locked up in pure, primal terror. The hand pushed through, fingers curling against the jagged edges of the wall. Too long. Too unnatural. Then came the whisper, right against my ear, though no one was beside me. Thank you. I barely had time to react before the rest of it emerged. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The breath had left my lungs the moment it crawled through the hole. A face, stretched and sunken, its skin paper thin and too pale, like it had been trapped in the dark for decades. Its eyes, black, hollow sockets, but I knew it was looking right at me. And the worst part? It was smiling. Not like a person. Not like anything human. Its mouth curled too wide, its teeth, jagged, broken, some missing entirely. It moved like something that had forgotten how to walk, twitching, jerking, as it dragged itself out of the wall. Its arms were too long. Its fingers scraped the floor. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I knew, deep, deep inside me, was that this thing wasn't the voice asking for help. That whisper had been something else. Something trapped. And I had just let this thing take its place. It lunged. I snapped out of my paralysis just in time to dodge, falling hard onto my side. Pain shot through my ribs, but I didn't stop. I scrambled back, my heart pounding so violently it felt like my chest would explode. The thing twitched, adjusting itself, almost like it was getting used to being free. It turned its head toward me, slow and deliberate. That smile was still there. I was waiting. It rasped, its voice dry and cracked. Then it started crawling toward me. Fast. I bolted. My legs nearly gave out as I ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I tore through the hallway, down the stairs, nearly slipping as I reached the front door. My fingers fumbled with the lock, shaking so violently I thought I wouldn't make it in time. Then, just as I got it open, the house shook. A guttural, inhuman screech filled the air. And then, everything went still. Dead silent. Like nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I ran. I didn't stop until I was miles away. And I never went back. The house was put up for sale a few months later. No one ever mentioned what happened. But sometimes I check the listings, just to see if someone new has moved in. And every time, every single time, the house is back on the market. No one stays for long. And I know why. Because whatever I let out that night, it's still in there. I don't remember much of what happened after I ran from the house that night. I must have driven for miles, but my hands were shaking so badly that I barely kept control of the wheel. My eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing crawling after me, its too wide smile stretching even further. But the road behind me was empty. The only sound was my own ragged breathing and the dull hum of the tires against the pavement. When I finally stopped, it was at a gas station off the highway, miles away from that place. I sat in my car, hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was still hammering in my chest, my whole body cold with sweat. I couldn't go back. I wouldn't go back. I had left everything behind, my clothes, my furniture, my life, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was getting as far away as possible. I spent the rest of the night in a motel, the cheapest one I could find. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and stale air, but at least the walls weren't alive. At least I could close my eyes without hearing that voice. Or so I thought. I barely slept. Every time my body drifted toward unconsciousness, my mind yanked me back. I kept hearing it, the tapping, the breathing, that whisper, but it wasn't real. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. I told myself that over and over again, but the fear had buried itself deep inside me, curling around my ribs like a vice. I had made a mistake I could never take back. The next morning, I forced myself to act normal. I showered, changed into the only extra clothes I had in my car, and grabbed a coffee from the gas station down the road. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't even bother drinking the coffee. My stomach was a tangled knot, nausea threatening to spill over. The rational part of me, the part that had always needed an explanation, was scrambling for an answer. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had been so sleep-deprived that my brain had created something that wasn't there. But then I remembered the recording on my phone. My chest tightened. I didn't want to listen to it again. I shouldn't listen to it again. But I had to. I sat in my car, staring at the screen. The file was still there, the timestamp from the night before. I hesitated for a long time before pressing play. At first, it was just silence. Then, the tapping. Soft, rhythmic, just like before. I swallowed hard. Then came the voice. Help me. I flinched. Even though I had already heard it, it still sent an icy wave through my body. I let the recording play. More tapping. More silence. Then, open it. My breath caught in my throat. But what came after? That was the part I hadn't noticed before. There was a pause. A long one. And then, So quiet, I almost missed it. Not human, not even close. I stopped the recording, my fingers cold against the phone. There was something else in that house. Something that had been waiting for me to break that wall open. And I had done exactly what it wanted. Oh, I had to know if anyone else had experienced the same thing. I pulled up the real estate listing for the house, heart hammering in my chest. It was already back on the market. No surprise there. The description was vague, the photos the same as before. Clean, staged, inviting. No mention of what was hidden beneath the surface. I dug deeper, searching for past owners, reviews, anything. And that's when I found it. A forum post, buried deep in the recesses of the internet. It was from years ago. A man had lived in that house before me. He had heard the tapping, the whispers, and he had done the same thing I had. He broke through the wall. His post ended abruptly, with no update, no further details. Just a final sentence that made my blood run cold. If you hear the voice, don't answer it. Don't break the wall. Once it's free, it never stops watching. I shut my laptop, my entire body tense. That thing, whatever it was, I had set it free. And now I wasn't sure if it was still trapped in that house, or if it had followed me. I never went back to that house. I never spoke to the real estate agent again. Never called to ask what happened to the next buyer. Never checked to see if the house was still on the market, because I already knew. That thing, whatever it was still there. Or worse, it wasn't. I had set it free. And the terrifying part? I didn't know if it was done with me. For weeks after I left, I tried to convince myself that I was safe. That all of it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. But the nights told me otherwise. It started with the dreams. Always the same, me standing in front of that wall, staring at the hole I had made. In the dream, I knew I had to run. I knew I had to wake up. But my body wouldn't move. My hands wouldn't respond. Then, in the darkness, something moved inside the hole. And before I could wake up, a voice, low, stretched, unnatural, would whisper the same words every time. I see you. It jolt awake, drenched in sweat, my pulse hammering in my ears. I told myself it was just my mind replaying the trauma. But then, the tapping started. At first, I thought I was imagining it. I was in a completely different city, staying in an apartment that was nothing like that house. A new place, new walls, new everything. And yet, one night, just as I was about to fall asleep, tap, 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 my body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was the building settling, that old pipes and wooden floors made noises all the time. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. Always in threes. Always close. I tried to ignore it. Until one night, it came from inside my closet. I didn't sleep after that. I kept the lights on, kept my phone within arm's reach, recording every night, hoping, praying that it'd wake up to silence. But the recordings told a different story. Some nights, it was just the tapping. Other nights, it was breathing. But then, one night, something worse happened. I was listening to the recording the next morning, exhausted but still desperate for answers. It started the same way, tapping, soft but deliberate. Then silence. And then, my own voice. I froze. I hadn't spoken that night. I hadn't said a single word. But on the recording, there it was. A low whisper. My own voice, but wrong. Slowed down. Distorted. I see you. I dropped my phone. My chest tightened. The air around me felt thick, suffocating. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. I moved again. Another city. another apartment. But it doesn't matter. It always finds me. The tapping, the breathing, the voice. No matter how far I go, it's there. Waiting, watching. And I know that one day I'll hear something worse. Not a whisper, not a tap. Something real. Something standing in the dark, just outside my line of sight. Waiting for me to break again. Waiting for me to answer. And this time, I don't think it'll be able to stop it.